The Second World War presents a catalyst for change that the world has rarely seen before. Wars and conflicts can, not only in the military sense, but perhaps more so in the economic, political, and cultural one, enable and foster immense change and growth.
Like a raging forest fire, war can leave behind what is at first sight a barren wasteland that nonetheless contains many nutrients. Nutrients that new flora can use to grow and blossom. The death of the old can make place for the new, where the once monumental trunks of giants now serve as the fuel for a new world.
But what if the giants are not burned to cinders, but survive, heavily scorched, but nevertheless standing? Their canopies will rob the young saplings of sunlight, and their roots, grown for centuries, will forcefully demand most, if not all, that the soil has to give. After all, these massive trunks have stood for ages, and their very survival depends on suppressing all other growth. These trees aren't merely tall, they are merciless. Why would they give up their rightful place as masters of this forest, of this world? I'm Indy Neidell, and welcome to War to War. Not to war, just War to War. A new series here on the TimeGhost channel where we cover the events that help humanity reach for the stars while at the same time bring us closer to destruction than we have ever been.
And I am Sebastian Brandstetter, and today we're going to talk about the fate of the colonial empires that dominated the world. In this brave new world, rising from the ashes of a truly monumental conflict, are they relics of an old world or the foundation of what's to come?
We should first address where they come from. In this case, though, their beginnings lie further back in the past than many people think.
Most of the time, when the beginnings of colonialism are talked about, it is guys like Christopher Columbus or Vasco da Gama at the tail end of the 15th century discovering new trade routes to India, or what they believe is India. But that is not accurate.
The economic model all the later colonial empires used was actually devised in the Canary Islands over the course of the 15th century. The total conquest of all the islands takes decades, and the native population is exterminated. Only 1,000 or so of an estimated 80,000 survive. And the Spaniards begin creating plantations on the islands and ferrying workers to them.
These islands were, in a real sense, testing grounds for Iberian colonialism in the New World. Not only were ideas and methods developed in the Canaries applied in the Americas, but the plunder of natural resources, development of plantation economies, widespread use of slave labor, unrestrained violence toward the indigenous population, and the devastating impact of disease also foreshadowed the Holocaust that was to engulf the New World.
This economic model, the claiming of land, the creation of plantation economies, the extraction of natural resources, and the use of indigenous people as slave labor, is then copied a bit later by the French and British in North America, Africa, Asia, and Australia.
By the end of the 19th century, the French and the British empires have long overtaken the Spanish and Portuguese ones. His or Her Majesty the King or Queen of the British Empire even reigns over an empire where the sun never sets, stretching some 35.5 million square kilometers across the globe at its largest extent. Some smaller states like the Netherlands and Belgium also use the same model.
That is almost a quarter of all land mass on Earth, or roughly twice as much as the surface of Pluto, making it the largest empire in the history of the world. While the French dominions does not reach such an extent, their empire likewise encompasses huge swaths of land, almost 13 million square kilometers, slightly less than the surface area of Pluto, which is obviously our standard measurement for such things.
Of course. Well, it's exciting to use, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that little planet was only discovered like 15 years ago.
I know.
Anyhow, together, colonial empires governed some 750 million people in 1945. That's 1/3 of today's total world population.
Wow.
As in the case of the Canary Islands, hundreds of years before, these empires have been grown on the backs of resource theft, economic exploitation, the slave trade, and genocide.
But these once-profit endeavors have recently stagnated. Since the end of the Great War in 1918, colonialism's heyday as a beneficial economic system for the colonizers has it's kind of past. Even before, at the end of the 19th century, stagnation rather than growth and prosperity characterized the economic reality of the empires.
There is no one reason for this, but rather a complex interplay of a variety of factors. To begin with, one very profitable aspect of colonialism, the slave trade, shrunk dramatically.
Yeah.
Over the course of the 19th century, Britain, France, Brazil, and the US first abolished the slave trade and then abolished slavery.
Together with what is sometimes referred to as the first wave of decolonization,
The independence of the Portuguese and Spanish South and Central American colonies in the first half of the 19th century.
thank you. This means, thank you,
You're welcome.
that the market for enslaved people is much, much smaller. That's not to say that it has disappeared. Many former slaves still live and work as de facto slaves, but it's nowhere near as widespread as before.
Another reason is the sheer size of the empires. Vast dominions go hand in hand with many military garrisons, thousands of miles from their seats of power, giant navies needed to patrol and safeguard trade routes, and large and often unwieldy colonial administrations. All those cost money, significant sums of money.
The colonial empires rely heavily on single natural resources and huge plantations for their wealth, and that works fine as long as they essentially hold a monopoly on those commodities. However, as global markets expand in the 19th and 20th centuries, more competitors enter the field, cutting into profits.
This makes the empires vulnerable if the price of one resource collapses.
Right.
For example, synthetic rubber threatens profits from natural rubber, and the rise of oil essentially destroys the whaling industry. At the same time, many colonies also begin manufacturing goods themselves, no longer serving their colonial overlords as willing consumer markets for products overseas, using raw materials first extracted from those colonies.
Okay, let's leave it with this, right? The economic situation today differs radically from that in which the empires were conceived and has turned colonies from a financial boon into an economic burden. On top of all this, we have the almost unfathomable costs of 2 world wars.
The economic costs of World War I hit Britain and France like a sledgehammer. They expended all they had to defeat the Central Powers and demanded more than ever from their colonies. When the war has ended, they are at the edge of financial ruin. With suffering citizens and a declining industry and economy at home, they stand at a crossroads. Country or empire first?
The simplest answer was that European nations had to choose between investing in empire abroad or social benefits at home. According to this logic, funding the welfare state depended on abandoning the expense of colonial administration overseas. Such a response regarded empires as an economic burden rather than a source of wealth, a perspective very different from that of the late 19th century.
The end of World War II brings these same problems back full force, and even worse than before. Picture a boat.
Right.
Its hull riddled with holes from small caliber arms fire.
Okay.
Okay? As water gushes in, the crew frantically scoops the water for their lives and manages to reach a fragile equilibrium.
Okay.
The vessel just atop the surface of the water.
Right.
And just as the boat is about to take up speed again,
Yeah.
it's yet again hit, and this time by 2 large caliber artillery shells.
Whoa.
No matter how many hands are called on deck, there is no bailing out this time.
That, or something like that, is the effect of World War I and World War II on the colonial economies of the British and the French empires. However, there is a crucial difference to the world post-World War I. See, there are 2 nascent superpowers now standing across from the fading juggernauts of the past, the United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. At this point, it is fair to say the US and the USSR have outgunned Britain and France, but that does not mean that the 2 empires of old, who still span the globe, stop regarding themselves as rulers of the world. So all 4 have different visions of what the world should look like and believe that they should have a definite say in determining its future.
With the USSR, its foundation is an evolving ideology from Marxism to Leninism to Stalinism. But one central tenet of the latter 2 is anti-imperialism.
Right.
This means that the Soviets opposed colonialism on principle. Imperialism, whose empires are based on capitalism, is what enables capitalism, and by extension the exploitation of the working class by those holding the means of production. That's the short version.
It's a good short version. But on an ideological level then, the Soviet Union wants a world with no colonies. But there is a problem, at least in the consistency of the Soviet argument, with the current westward encroachment of Soviet influence, in most cases by more than questionable means, suppressing local elites, silencing critics, targeted violence, things like that. There is an argument to be made that what they want is not an end to colonialism, but just the dawn of their very own shadow empire in a federal union of quasi-independent states.
There is another power that opposes colonialism,
Yeah,
the United States of America. The Atlantic Charter, jointly proclaimed by US President Franklin Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in 1941, outlines their post-war vision of the world.
Yeah.
In the context of this video, its third article is of special importance.
Respect the rights of all people to choose the form of government under which they will live, and to see sovereign rights and self-government restored to those who have been forcibly deprived of them. Contradictions between this statement and the colonial empires of Britain and France immediately arise. But there is a solution: mental gymnastics.
In a statement to the House of Commons shortly after the agreement was signed, Prime Minister Churchill stated that the right to self-determination outlined in the Charter would apply to those living under Nazi occupation, but not to Britain's colonial subjects still in need of progressive evolution towards self-government.
Yet Roosevelt publicly maintains that it should apply to all peoples, including the colonies, leading Churchill to comment, "I have not become the King's first minister in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire."
There is another thing that complicates the relationship between Britain, France, and the United States. Both Britain and France lean heavily on the United States economically. Wartime aid from Washington has left them with massive debts, and now they need further American loans for post-war reconstruction.
With their economies on American life support, Britain and France have little choice but to bow to U.S. demands when it comes to trade and, importantly, decolonization. It's an unequal dynamic between so-called allies, where the old empires must somehow justify clinging to their colonies while relying on the financial lifeline of a superpower that publicly promotes self-determination.
But just like the Soviet Union stands on anti-imperialism or anti-colonialism, the United States also isn't free of contradictions when it champions self-determination. After all, what do you call the unincorporated territories like Hawaii or Puerto Rico, if not colonies in all but name? And what about the Philippines? Will the US honor the promises made in the Philippine Independence Act of 1934 and grant them independence now that the war is over?
Well, it looks like it. I mean, we'll see soon enough. But there are also other reasons why the U.S. wants an end to the colonial system, and it has to do with trade and access to resources. See, the British and French empires both employ a shared mechanism called imperial preference, at least in the British case, right?
And this means that trade between the members of the empire is encouraged, while trade with outsiders is discouraged.
The United States, whose primary goal is to establish a liberal and free global market economy after the war, is naturally not a fan of this.
Moreover, replacing imperial privilege with an open door policy also means that the United States has access to goods and resources previously reserved for the British and French empires only, or somewhat only. There's also a difference in the way the French and the British see the future of the world.
Or rather, the two colonial empires have been following different paths for centuries, and this is something that both France and Britain want to continue, undeterred by the economic challenges which we have already discussed.
Like Churchill, Charles de Gaulle, chairman of the Provisional Government of the French Republic until January this year, does not want to relinquish French colonial possessions. His attitude can be paraphrased like this: without its empire, France would no longer be a great power.
The difference between the French and British colonial administrations hinges on their guiding principles. The French prioritize assimilation and centralization, whereas the British emphasize informal empire and pragmatism.
Informal empire describes the British tendency to use moderate local elites to facilitate the governing of a colony in their name.
Right.
The British also employ a more pragmatic policy, varying local policies depending on unique wants and needs, including promises of independence in some cases.
Yeah.
For example, consider the British negotiations with India about independence, which go back to at least 1930.
Contrast that with the French doctrine of assimilation, which states that the colonies are supposed to be part of France, an extension of the French nation. So to attain this goal, the French, unlike the British, rely heavily on centralized special directives issued by the executive branch, not Parliament. This leads to their colonial approach lacking the flexibility of the British one, while in some cases forcing a universal policy where it just does not fit.
And that brings us to another reason the Soviet Union and the United States want to see the colonies as newly independent and unaligned states.
A future clash between the two looks very likely. For the moment, this clash is limited to the realms of ideology and diplomacy, liberal democracy and a free market versus communism.
In their attempts to overtake the other, they vie for the attention of new potential allies, and the colonies could be just that. Colonialism has left millions dead, disfigured, traumatized, forcibly relocated to strange lands, and enslaved.
It's no wonder that most colonial subjects take issue with the current system. Here too, the change is not new, but goes back to the beginnings of the 20th century. First, colonized people everywhere saw Japan, a non-European, uncivilized nation, beat the Russian Empire in the Russo-Japanese War.
20 years later, they witnessed Mustafa Kemal Atatürk and the Young Turks denounce, fight, and triumph over the colonial future of what today is Turkey. They saw Faisal bin Hussein attempt to found an independent Arab state.
But they themselves were asked to fight and bleed and die for their colonial overlords in the Great War. There are many such soldiers who in the 1920s wonder exactly what they were fighting for. To preserve a system where they are second-class citizens?
As is the case with the economic problems facing the colonial system, World War II brings these issues back to the fore and stronger than before. Over 2 million Indian volunteers fight for Britain, sure, but alongside that are not just the ever-growing movement for Indian independence. Gandhi was very opposed to a war ostensibly fought for democratic freedom while India didn't have it, but movements to join Axis instead of the Allies in order to try to leave British dominance.
On top of that, Britain and France, once perceived as undefeatable imperial juggernauts, well, they really struggled against the Germans, and their colonial forces were easily beaten by the Japanese. Now they are no longer seen as unassailable powers, but rather as vulnerable, as mighty oaks that still can, in fact, be felled.
To those colonies, this serves as a beacon, as a ray of hope. The power of France and Britain, but also Belgium, the Netherlands, and Portugal, is not absolute. The power of Europe is waning, and the new leaders of the world sit in America and Asia, in the new world.
No wonder, then, that already towards the end of the war, protests, uprisings, and rebellions occur throughout the colonial world. The atmosphere it's beyond tense. In Vietnam, the Viet Minh call for independence. India wants to shatter the jewel of the imperial crown and become its own nation. In Africa, people likewise begin to ask themselves, where does our future lie? In the Middle East, tension against the British is brewing from all sides.
At the same time, the US and the USSR wait with open arms, willing to take everyone in to thwart the other. After all, everyone not on our side is likely going to be on the enemy's side, right?
Right. Maybe. But if tensions with the Soviets escalate further, Washington might be forced to soften its anti-colonial stance for the sake of unity. Britain and France are too vital as allies to alienate by demanding immediate decolonization when a new global confrontation seems to be in the cards.
This whole situation leaves the oppressed with several choices. They could remain a colony.
Sure.
Or they could demand independence and self-determination and turn to the West or the East.
Right.
There's also the option of becoming an independent and unaligned state. Which way will they choose? And given everything we talked about, will the trees continue to dominate the forest and suppress new growth? Or will they be, willing or not, felled by a surge of new and willful saplings, unwilling to live in their shadow any longer?
For now, that remains to be seen. In future episodes, we will cover the first surges of resistance against the colonial world order and see which way some colonies will choose for themselves. Stay with us at War to War as these uprisings intensify and the old empires fight to hold on. If you want to help keep this story alive, join the TimeGhost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. It is the TimeGhost Army that drives every episode we make. Until next time, Excelsior!